Welcome to the HeroX Innovation Leadership Speaker Series. We're talking to innovation leaders who are doing innovation differently. We're talking today to Andrea Silverstone and Carrie McManus from Sagesse Domestic Violence Prevention Society and authors of Innovation at the Back of the Bus. Andrea and Carrie, thank you so much for joining. Can you introduce yourselves and tell us about Sagesse and your roles?
Great. Well, thank you so much for having us. We're really excited to chat with you today. So I'm Andrea Silverstone. I am the CEO of Sagesse. Sagesse is an organization that operates in Canada in the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan. And we work with individuals and organizations and communities to disrupt the structures of abuse. And what really that means to us is that we would like every human being in the world to be able to have personal agency, the ability to make decisions that are in their own best interest, free from fear and free from coercive control in that process.
And I'm Carrie McManus, and I am the Director of Innovation and Programs at Sagesse. So within my role, I'm the big thinker person who comes up with ideas, tests things, live in the place of thought experiments whenever possible.
Excellent. Thanks so much. It's really great to have you here. Can you talk about how you landed on the idea of writing a book about civil society sector innovation?
So this was a COVID project. So this is the history, and I'll let Carrie, chip in along the way. So COVID hit us with, I'm going to say COVID hit the world, but it hit our organization with less than 2 weeks notice. All of a sudden, everything shut down, society shut down, the world shut down. And it was terrible and it was devastating, and many partner organizations shut their doors. And we pivoted really, really fast to being able to offer either online programs or in-person programming with masks and PPE, but whatever it was, we learned really, really quickly, like within a period of less than 2 weeks, how to pivot while other organizations had shut their doors. And essentially we were like head down into it and just focusing. And when we finally kind of stopped, I set up like a little living room in my garage so that Carrie and I could still meet, with the door open. And anyway, so I set up a little living room in my garage. And so I would say like kind of a few months into this journey, once we could like put our head up and go like, okay, let's take a breath. We were like, holy, that happened really quickly and it happened really efficiently and happened like in ways that like all of our staff were also able to move very fast through it. And then we're like, oh, that might be because we're an organization that focuses on innovation. Let's take more into that. And I'll let Carrie take it from there because she's the digger.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think there was something that happened for us in COVID where there wasn't actually even a question. I can remember distinctly the conversation that I had with the operating team that delivers our direct service programming, where I didn't say to them, do you think, or would it be possible? I said to them, you have 2 weeks to figure out how to do our programming online. And they didn't say, what? Are you crazy? There's no way. We've never done this before. They said, okay. And they just went away and they just did it. And I think, when Andrea talks about that moment of lifting our heads, part of what was fascinating in the moment of lifting our heads was that we were being asked by other organizations how to do this. And they were just at that place of saying, what if we did virtual programming? Or what if we figured out a different alternative model? And so we were able to help, and that was great. But there was something for me about this idea of like, why does it seem like for us, we just immediately went to that place? And for other people, it's taken so long and it's so different. And not just for us, because I think that I know and I have always known that Andrea and I move very quickly and are willing to just be in whatever we need to be in and test ideas and throw things out. But what was really striking to me, and I think where the idea of the book really rooted out of, was that it wasn't about Andrea and I, it was about our team. It was about the fact that because we already talked about innovation, because we already operated in this way, because we had all of these frameworks, when I said to the team, you have 2 weeks, nobody said to me, that's crazy. There's no way, and there was like the first group we ran online, we had people walking in the background of groups. We had all kinds of things that we were like, the next day I had like a conversation with our clinical person who was like, these terrible things happen during group. And I was like, great, let's make some guidelines for clients about Zoom usage, right? So then we did that, and then something else would happen. We'd go, oh crap, we forgot to add that idea to the guideline. And so we learned as we went. It wasn't that in 2 weeks we did it perfectly, but in 2 weeks we did it well enough that people who otherwise were isolated in their home, possibly with somebody who was using abuse, were able to access community and safety. And for me, that was the goal. And we have a staff team that for them, that was the goal also. It wasn't about perfection, it was about the incremental steps to get you there. And so I think the book came out of the idea of what is it that Andrea and I do or create in a culture, in a mindset that allows our staff to be in that place, and how could you recreate that in places that are not our organization?
Right. So that was a crisis moment, if you will. It was, we need to do something because there is this situation to react to. In the introduction of the book, and I'm going to probably be plugging the book a lot because I'm
Awesome.
enjoy it. In the introduction, it says, quote, as our world changes, we must change with it. Without change, our organizations will struggle to fulfill our mandates or make a difference. I feel like these things are said a lot. They can be more difficult to practice. Real change, there needs to be a trigger or some kind of signal that a change is needed. But there also needs to be acknowledgement and reception of the signal and the open-mindedness and willingness to put the work in to make that change. So, Andrea, you mentioned we were an organization focused on innovation, and that's why we were able to make these changes so quickly. What was the beginning of that innovation journey? How did that become instilled in you all? What was the need or the signal that said we need to be a different kind of organization to have real impact?
So I'm going to jump into something that nobody wants to talk about when we talk about this in the book. It starts with the fields, right? It starts with emotional capacity to engage. And so before I think you can even talk about how did our organization get to a place that we invested in innovation, and I can talk about the tactical of how we invested in it. I think that there's a million tactical ways to invest in innovation. I don't think any of them are right, and I don't think any of them are wrong, because I actually don't think the tactics of it are the relevant thing. I think that what is the relevant thing is to create the emotional capacity to be able to engage in it in the first place. And by emotional capacity, that means that you have to be able to sit in discomfort, sit in the fact that you might not be the expert. For us, part of how we built our emotional capacity was by getting really clear about our values as an organization, which are about vulnerability and curiosity and courage and trusting in the messiness. They don't have to be the values for everyone, but there are values that guide us. I joke in the agency, if I'm in therapy, everybody's in therapy, because I actually think that the personal is political. And if I've got stuff that's standing in my way emotionally, it's going to stand in my way as a leader, and it's going to stand in your way as a coordinator, if that's where you're at in the organization, or as our director of innovation. And so I actually think it all has to start with that. And then also, we have boards of directors in Canada. And so you also have to have a board of directors that's willing to engage in the fields, right? And so we were an organization that I think was really, I think even before we got into innovation, we were into that work, right? I think about like the work that we did around Brene Brown, like we did a lot of Brene Brown's, I can't remember what it was called at the time, but I think Daring Leadership, I think she called it. Brene Brown had like offered a series of workshops that our staff and some of our board engaged in around daring leadership. We also looked into some of Susan Scott's work around fierce conversations. Like we were trying as an organization to build our capacity, which meant when we finally started having the innovation conversation, there wasn't resistance to the conversation. There was curiosity and bravery and a capacity to trust in the messiness, which then eventually led to our board of directors saying, okay, we'll invest, depending on our year, 2 to 4% of our global budget into this work so that we can pay Carrie to sit in our office and think. But that's a brave thing to do. And it required all of those things before that to get there.
I also think, there is a step, I think, in some ways before that, Andrea, which is the ability to, even before we sort of thought about investing or we thought about building the staff capacity and investment, there was an ability for you and I to connect on what if we ... kind of basis. And I think that, when I joined the organization, I remember very clearly having a conversation with someone whose position I was taking over. They were going on a mat leave and they said, don't change anything. And I said, okay, great. And then the next day I went into Andrea's office and I said, what if I took this thing that's our core program and I changed it to be different? And Andrea was like open to it and said, okay. And so me as a new staff person was like, oh, okay, well, this is a place where I can come up with ideas, where I could say things, or we could look at things being different. And I think that, Andrea as a leader and someone who'd been in the organization for a long time saw the opportunity for new ideas and new perspectives within that conversation. And I think because of that, it led us to a place where we did all of that work with Brene Brown. We started asking all of those questions and we started saying, like, what if as an organization we thought more about our values and what does that mean? And it's not about something that you can put on a piece of paper or put on a website and looks good, but like, what if we actually live those? How do you do that? But I think all of that had to come from an openness of the two of us to say, what do we know and what do we not know? And let's not be scared of the thing that we don't know. Let's step into that. And that created all of the conditions that allowed us to then say, what if we explored this more in our work and in our delivery?
I just want to add something because I think that this is kind of really poignant. We joke about Candy McStone, which is our alter ego, the two of us in the book, but so much of why we're in innovation and why we've been able to do what we've been able to do is because of the synergy between Carrie and I. And one of the questions that we often get asked is, what if we don't have a Candy McStone? What if it's me by myself? Then what do I do? We've thought about the answer to that and we can talk more about that, but I think that that's an important ingredient that we were very lucky to found.
So I want to talk a little bit about the back of the bus. I think that this was a really cool analogy because if you do imagine yourself in the back of a bus, you talk about perspective and freedom, opportunity, but also bumpiness, right? It's bumpier back there. Sometimes you got to hold on. But the difference is you all have to keep yourselves at the back of the bus. It's likely a momentous and energetic time when you decide, okay, we are going to be an organization that innovates from the back of the bus so that we have this perspective and this freedom and this opportunity. But a year, 2 years, 5 years down the road, you have to keep that perspective. How do you do that? How do you maintain that perspective that we have to do things differently? We can't be set in our ways. We have to question things and also balance yourselves to not question things just for the sake of questioning them.
I mean, that's such a great question. And in some ways, I think we are currently going through a lived experience of having parts of our work and parts of our organization move more to the front of the bus and now kind of coming back to the back again. And I think part of it is about being open to saying, I, in my role, am really always at the back of the bus. It's sort of where I like to be. I can sit at the front. I can show up in those other ways, in those other spaces. I can hold, you know, programmatic integrity and fidelity and all of that kind of stuff. But if I had my choice, I'd always kind of be at the back. And so where do we create space for fluctuation within ourselves and within our teams? We have a staff team that a little bit is divided into folks who get to sit at the back of the bus all the time, that are doing research, that are doing new projects, that are doing evaluation, that are onboarded to constantly live in that place of fluctuation and change. And then we have staff who do direct service delivery, which means they actually have to sit a little bit more at the front, right? They have to do the same thing. Every time a client calls, there's forms that have to be filled out and there's engagement models and all of that kind of stuff. But I think that creating space for them to say, your lived experience of the bus is slightly different, but it's no less valuable. And it's not innovation just because you're doing it the same or because you have systems or you have processes. So part of what we talk about within our team is sort of what are the different kinds of levels of innovation, right? And we've divided it into 3 levels. And The base level is everybody's responsibility. It is, if you're the client person and you have to sit at the front of the bus because you have to do the same thing all the time, that's awesome. But don't do the same thing if it's broken. Fix it, right? Or if it gets broken at some point while you're doing it, change it. If the clients say to you over and over and over again, we need something different, give them something different, right? And so we empower everybody, no matter where they're sitting, to be able to do that and recognize that my job ideally is to sit at the back of the bus and to do transformational innovation. What are the big ideas? I'm in the big bumps. I'm all of that. But that's not more valuable than the folks that are sitting at the front doing the process things. It's just different. And we actually need to have all of it. And I think that, throughout the process of writing the book, we also were maturing as an organization within how we thought about and articulated innovation. And so some of the content in the book about how to implement innovation is new content that came as we kind of figured that out ourselves, and then went back and go, oh, we should probably talk in the book about how to actually do that, right? And like Andrea said, there's no right or wrong way. We have a way that works for us. It has changed over the period of time that we have done that, and I assume it will continue to change. But I think that for me, that's sort of the thing that I think about, is that within our staff team, we have to be open to all of that. And even within our sector and our work, right? I'm also the director of programs, which means sometimes I have to show up with my different hat and I have to sit at the front. But the other thing that I'll say is that part of my ability to sit at the back of the bus, and I think Andrea's ability to sit at the back of the bus, is that we truly believe that we should be working towards a world where we don't need to exist. And it's easy to get sucked into growth, opportunity, building out programs, hiring more staff, having more footprint, all of those things. Super easy to do. Super easy to chase the funding, to go, we're going to go a little bit offside what we normally do because this funding calls for this and this funding calls for this, and to build an empire. And we really truly believe we don't want to do that. And I think because we've always believed that, in some ways it's easy to stay at the back of the bus, because in my heart of hearts, I don't absolutely zero desire to sit at the front of the bus all the time. It's just not of interest.
I'm going to jump ahead to a question because you just mentioned something, which is working in a world where you don't need to exist, where Sagesse does not need to exist. You mentioned the first time that we talked. I think this is one of the bold statements I've heard from you all. I think it's something you would hear an organization say, but, or maybe in an internal meeting. But it was one of the first things you said to me. And it's a bold statement to say out loud to the public, to strangers, to say, we don't need to exist. We hope we don't need to exist. Can you explain what that means for the audience in terms of the work that you do, your mission, your vision, and what it would mean if you didn't exist?
So I want to just start by saying our organization was founded about 40 plus years ago. And when our organization was founded, our founder was like 30 years and we'll have, gotten this issue of domestic violence eradicated in society and we'll be able to close our doors. She was very, I think optimistic, but I think that we were founded with that idea. And I think that when we say that we should no longer have to exist, it's because we have changed or supported the change in society of norms, attitudes, values, and beliefs so that no one wants to harm each other anymore, right? So that society is a more peaceful, respectful society. And when we say that, yeah, it's a really bold statement, but I think we really believe it. We really want to be in that place. And I think in many ways, it's only through the audacity of wanting to be in that place that we can come up with the creative and crazy ideas that we do, right? Because it's just not satisfactory for us not to be in that place of believing the world can be better and that we should be out of business. And therefore, we should be trying, if our product is to be out of business, we need to try every possible action available to us to try and get ourselves there.
And there's something It's interesting to me. I mean, I distinctly remember having a conversation with Andrea where we looked at the numbers and who's experiencing domestic abuse and how many people call us and how many people don't, right? And then the number of people who are experiencing domestic abuse who call a formal organization is tiny. It is, and it always has been. And it was really striking to me from that idea of like, we actually have like, I think, a responsibility to say we should be putting ourselves out of work, right? And I have said that it's interesting that you say it's like a bold statement to say out loud to people because I say it out loud to lots of people. And I had somebody once say to me, social workers will never not exist. And I said, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that social workers shouldn't exist, right? There are things that in the world that people will need help and support for always. But domestic abuse does not have to be one of those. Domestic abuse is not something that has to exist in the world, right? Mental health is always going to exist. It is not a curable thing, and therefore people will always need help and support around various experiences of mental health. Domestic abuse doesn't have to, and we've created such level of tolerance around it that it seems audacious that I would say domestic abuse doesn't have to exist and I could not have a job. But there is something kind of striking to me about the level of just sort of acceptance of the status quo of a statement like, we will always exist as a domestic abuse organization.
It's so accepted that it seems out of the norm for you to say something like that. It seems
Yes.
bold for you to say something
Yes.
like that because it is so accepted.
And there's a part of me that feels like it is bold to assume that my organization should continue to exist. Because in order for me to continue to have a job, people have to continue to be harmed. And when you think about it from that perspective, it makes me feel a little sick to my stomach to say, I want my organization
Absolutely.
to grow and I want to have more staff. Well, if I'm seeking that, I'm saying I want people to continue to be being harmed. I don't at all. And I shouldn't.
Yeah. Every equation has two sides, and you have to always consider both sides of the equation. It's in the book, there's a concept, a unique perspective called the objective solution inversion trap, the OSI trap. And when I read this, I knew right away that I fall into this trap very often. I describe HeroX as a crowdsourcing platform, which we are. Sometimes I describe it slightly better as a massive global community of solvers. But really, and based on what we were originally intended to be, i.e., our objective, we create new and innovative ways to solve hard problems. We leverage our great community of innovators. We leverage this platform designed for noble competition. But reversing that language about what we do allows us to re-embody our vision. And I thought that was a really powerful insight. How did the objective of empowering victims of domestic abuse, not just sheltering them, open Sagesse up to innovating programming like supporting informal networks?
So this actually goes back to the question that you asked about putting ourselves out of business, right? Because if we stay focused on the idea that the product, right, is to eradicate domestic abuse, right, or to have a society where everybody has peaceful, respectful relationships or personal agency, well, then there's so many different ways to get to that outcome. And we're going to try every conceivable way. And we're not going to get stuck in an OSI trap because we're not saying we are an organization that offers peer-based groups, right? We are an organization that, I don't know, makes systemic change with government policies. I don't know, whatever the pathways are, which means that we are actually willing to try any pathway to get there. So can you tell me again how you would describe yourself when you want to describe yourself?
We solve hard problems in new and innovative ways, or we use innovative methods to solve hard problems.
Right. So right now, part of how you think that you're doing that is through a crowdsourcing platform or through pulling innovators together. But tomorrow, you might discover that there's a much better way to do that. And so if you stick with that idea, then that means that you're open to any possibility of any journey that will get you there. right? Like, let's say that you met a magical genie tomorrow, and the magical genie was like, if everybody stands on their head for 5 minutes today, you're going to get that outcome. You would be open to it
Right.
because you're not stuck in that idea of the way that you're doing. And so I think for us, that's what it's about. And also, we'd like to have fun, which you can get from the book, right? And so we like the absurdity of life. Like, I don't know a better way to say it, right? But there's an absurdity to life. And if you're really, really open to there could be a really absurd way or a creative way, if you want to describe it that way, to get to this outcome that we never thought of before. But if we open our mind to it, we can engage with it, right? That's what thought experiments essentially are.
Right. Thought experiments, which were kind of your initial benchmarking test or initial rigor that you put some kind of what if statement up against, right?
Totally. And so the idea of informal support comes from that, right? So it comes from, and it's taken us a long time. It's an ongoing journey, but it comes from a conversation of Andrea and I going, okay, well, we do this great program delivery for people who are kind of already engaged in the social service sector. Who does everybody else talk to? We know rates are way higher. We have no idea actually how high. We know most people don't talk to police. Most people don't talk to us. Who do they talk to? Right. And so then that thought experiment goes, well, okay, well, that's striking to think that we're not helping a tiny spectrum of the population. Okay, well, then who are they talking to? Right. And so then you start to sort of dig on that. Well, okay, well, they're talking to friends and they're talking to family. Okay, great. They're talking to somebody. Oh, well, then you dig a little bit more and you go, well, actually, that can be really bad if that person has a negative response. Okay, so then what can you do? Well, actually, you could teach that person to have a better response. Okay, well, then what does that do? Right. And you start to just unpack all of these things down. And, so over the years, we've created programmatic interventions that go into this thought experiment. And we continue to create those. We're about to start a new research project as part of this thought experiment around supporting people who are perpetrating abuse. Because, what if we could stop perpetration of abuse because a friend or family member said, hey, you seem like you're talking in a really inappropriate way to your partner, or hey, you seem really upset. Are you okay? Is there some way we can help you so that this doesn't become this, right? And so that thought experiment leads to the next one, to the next one, to the next one. But you have to be open to saying, what if there is a better way, a different way, an additional opportunity within this? If we just did peer support, then we could be the best group peer support program that exists. I would suggest, as a side, we probably are. We're one of the only, but we would still just be just that little skin at the bottom. That's all we would be touching. And so if you take the idea of putting yourself out of work and you think about that little skin at the bottom, you realize those two are just never going to correspond. They're never going to meet up unless I had a mentor when I was in school who said you shouldn't, and she was talking from a clinical perspective, but she said, you shouldn't ask the question unless you're prepared to deal with the answer. And I love that from a clinical perspective, but I love that in life in general. And I feel like I'm someone who has to ask the question. And then as soon as I go, crap, we're dealing with 13% of the population. Where is everybody else going? Well, now I have to deal with the answer. I don't know what the answer is, but I got to figure it out, and I got to deal with it, and I got to do something.
I just want to go back to being really clear about that OSI trap, because Carrie and I didn't have any information that no other domestic violence agency had. The stats that we're talking about are from Statistics Canada. They're published every few years through long form statistics. It was no new information. And it wasn't even special private information. It was Stats Canada publishes information. And I think that if we were in the OSI trap, we would have said, how do we bring more people through our front door? But because we were not in the OSI trap, it was well, who are they going to? And how are those people responding? And what if we were able to figure all of those things out?
It's interesting because the OSI trap can give you the perspective that you are a demand-based organization, and that is the opposite of what you want to be. So with the challenges that I get to run, we get to do some really cool challenges, crowdsourcing initiatives, and we do different types. We do single phase for, I think we did one with Edmonton for catalytic converter theft, where actually the winning solutions came from a mother-daughter duo who had their catalytic converter stolen from they were local, to multi-phase challenges where NASA needed solutions that could transmit and store electricity that was generated on the lunar surface. And they actually tested these in vacuum chambers. And so there's this down select all through all of that. If it's a single phase challenge where our goal is to lower the barrier to entry so that anyone can submit an idea, and it's not just your typical contractors or organizations, or it's these bigger challenges that are going to have more runway and stretch out over a longer period of time. Innovation is in everything. And with innovation, there is inherent risk, and there is not just risk of failure, but acceptance of failure and encouragement of failure because of the learning that comes with failure. But you all are a nonprofit organization. So I'm assuming there is a portion of funding, at least, that comes from public sources or philanthropic sources. How do you manage that risk of failure and that acceptance and embracing of failure that comes with innovation with letting the funding sources know, no, don't worry, it's going to be okay?
Oh, this is such a good question because, so like Carrie said, we're at a very difficult moment in time in our organization. We actually just lost a bunch of funding. And I think that part of why we lost it, I mean, there's lots of reasons, but because we're not an organization that will give a funder a definitive answer. We won't, because we think that that's unethical. We won't say to a funder, if you put this money in, you're going to get that red gumball out. We'll say to them, yeah, we want to get a red gumball out, but it's actually very possible that we'll learn through this process that either one, the red gumball doesn't exist. It's a green gumball that you want. It's actually, 7 purple ones. Like, we don't know. Right? All that we can say is that we're starting with this assumption and we're going to try this pathway to get there, but we could find ourselves deviating at different points, but it will be organized, well recorded, benchmarked, researched. Like, we can guarantee that there's a framework around that. And some funders are very excited by that and are fully willing to be on the journey with us. And other funders are not. And what we have had to figure out as an organization is how do we act in our integrity with the funders that are not, right? And so part of this loss of funding that we've recently had is, there's like this part of us is like, why don't we lie, right? Like, why didn't we just say that thing, right? And that of course we would never do, because there's as an organization, we can't live in that integrity, but it's also meant that we really have to get really clear on like our values, who we are, and we have to have a board of directors in an organization that is willing to like sit in that extreme discomfort. On the other side of it, it's also offers us lots of opportunity. There have been funders that want to invest in us because of that, right? So I think that we're just sort of in a moment in the time in the world where it's a little bit different for one of our main funders about how they feel about those things. But that funder prior to like this particular political climate before was actually a funder that invested in us heavily because of our innovation, right? They wanted us to do the experiments, to tell them enough information so that they could figure out how to be the best fund.
We also operate in this framework of risk that is associated with, I think, both the population we serve and the background of how we do that, right? And so, we operate in this social service sector. We're primarily social workers. Social workers are inherently risk adverse. We work with a population that presents as incredibly vulnerable. And so we also have to, so while managing that from a funding perspective, we also are managing that from an ethical practice perspective, right? And we have had people say to us before, like, you're going to cause harm to women and children. And part of what we have to do is know enough. And I think that, interestingly, like our analogy is to be at the back of the bus, but I would say that we're probably 15 buses maybe ahead of other folks. So we know enough to know we're not going to cause harm. We know enough in our rooting of our practice models and our frameworks and all of that to say we can experiment because we've done enough work and background and research to know that we're not going to cause harm. clients. And this is the way that we're going to manage that. And this is the way that we're going to track that. But I think that often can leave people, funders included, feeling really anxious about innovation within this particular sphere because we see this very human reality of what happens. And interestingly enough, I think that experience of risk aversion that drives people to stay status quo is also for me the thing that drives me to change, because I see that human reality of you're not getting the thing you need. And I could give you the thing that you need if I was willing to challenge myself, learn more, grow, etc.
What would be the most important piece of advice you would give or could give to someone else working in a nonprofit organization, trying to make an impact, wants to do more innovation, wants to become an organization that embodies innovation like you all have?
I say two things. The first is the thing that I said at the beginning, which is you need to engage in your own work, and that's really, really important. And the second is something Carrie and I have talked about of what do you do when you don't have a candy mix down? Just ask one more question. Ask one more question than the amount of questions you thought you were going to ask.
Yeah. And the thing that I would add to that is I think just sit in the unknown, be a voyeur, sit in a place where you are not trying to solve anything or figure it out or actively in it, and just observe and take it in and allow yourself to just be in that moment and see where that happens and where that goes, right? That allows you to think about then how do you ask that, one more question than what is comfortable.
It's the clinical work of sitting in the discomfort.
Easier said than done, right? But
well, that's why you need a therapist.
So for those who want to learn more about the methodology, your work at Sagesse, or the movement that you continue to inspire, where can they connect with you and find more resources?
They could buy our book. They could go to our website, www.sagesse.org, and buy our book, or they could reach out to us also through our website. And we're always up for like a great conversation. I actually had a meeting this morning that was like just a great conversation about a bunch of different ways of thinking about things.
Yeah, that's what this was too. Thank you so much. And we'll include that information, the links and everything in the descriptions. So Andrea and Carrie, thank you so much. This is very enlightening, and I have a feeling there may be a part 2. This is really good. We could go deeper for sure. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having us.